August 26, 1346. On a rain-soaked field near the village of Crécy in France, 9,000 weary English soldiers braced themselves against 30,000 of Europe's most elite knights. The French appear unbeatable, superior in numbers, armed with heavy cavalry, and boasting the very flower of European nobility. Their confidence is so absolute that high-born lords quarrel over who will earn the glory of slaying the English king. 4 hours later, the battlefield tells a different story. 1,500 French nobles lie dead, princes, dukes, and kings among them. The English? Only 40 men lost, not 440. In one afternoon, 5 centuries of armored dominance collapsed, undone by commoners wielding wood and string. The blind king of Bohemia rode straight into the storm of death, unwilling to be left out of the slaughter. French knights crushed their own men in panic as they fled. The Genoese crossbowmen, hired to support them, were slaughtered by the very nobles who commanded them. For weeks afterward, crows grew so bloated, feasting on noble flesh, they could hardly lift from the ground. This was the Battle of Crécy, the day medieval warfare died in the mud. The moment when the idea of nobility through combat was shattered by the hands of peasant archers, and the 100 Years' War truly began with France's most humiliating defeat. By the end of this video, you'll see how a weapon worth 10 shillings destroyed armor priced at £1,000, why French knights turned on their own mercenaries mid-battle, and how a blind king's doomed charge became one of the most tragically noble deaths in military history. Let's set the scene. Edward III of England had recently landed in Normandy with around 15,000 men, pressing his claim to the French throne through his mother's lineage. His forces carved a path of destruction across northern France in what was called a chevauchée, legalized plunder meant to expose the French king's inability to protect his people. After looting Caen, the English were retreating toward the English-held port of Calais when the French army finally caught them. Philip VI of France had raised the mightiest host in Christendom, 30,000 to 35,000 men, including 12,000 heavy cavalry, knights clad in full plate atop armored horses. This was no ordinary army. Nearly every great noble in France was there, joined by allied princes and monarchs from across Europe. The Holy Roman Empire sent contingents. The King of Bohemia arrived with his court. Even Moravia sent knights. It was a medieval Avengers assemble, united by one goal: English blood. The French knight was the tank of his age, a mounted warrior in full armor with his steed, weighed close to a ton. Raised for battle from childhood, trained to fight before most peasants learned to read, their armor cost more than a village earned in a lifetime. For 500 years, the thunder of the cavalry charge had decided European wars. Infantry existed to be crushed underhoof. Archers were nuisances. Real men, noblemen, fought sword to sword on horseback. Edward III knew his odds were hopeless, outnumbered 3 to 1, drained from weeks of raiding, and short on supplies. Yet he held one advantage: the French scorned 5,000 Welsh and English longbowmen. Most were peasants or criminals, hardened by years of archery practice enforced by English law. Every Sunday after church, men were required to train with the bow. Playing other sports instead was literally illegal. The longbow itself was plain, a 6-foot stave of yew wood, but deadly in skilled hands. A practiced archer could loose 12 arrows a minute, striking targets 250 yards away, about 2.5 football fields. The pull was enormous, between 150 and 80 pounds. Archaeologists can still identify longbow archers by their warped skeletons, the left arm stretched longer from years of strain. Edward positioned his army on high ground, forcing the French to attack uphill. He divided his forces into 3 lines, the archers forming a V between them for overlapping fields of fire. Then he did something no king had ever dared. He ordered his knights to dismount and fight on foot. English nobles fighting as infantry. It was unheard of. But Edward understood what his enemies did not. The age of the mounted knight was ending. His command sent shockwaves through his camp. Men bred for the roar of the charge, whose horses were worth their weight in gold, now had to fight beside peasants. Pride clashed with survival, but Edward made it clear only the living would keep their honor. One by one, armored nobles trudged into the mud beside bowmen in woolen hoods, a sight no soul in Christendom had ever witnessed. That night, the English camp was eerily calm. Archers tended their bows, rubbing beeswax on strings to repel moisture. Stakes were hammered into the ground, trenches dug by torchlight. Chroniclers say Edward even distributed meat and ale, so his men slept on full stomachs, while the French stumbled into camp, half-starved after their forced march. Everything about the English lines spoke of discipline. Everything about the French army reeked of arrogance. Edward's men fortified the slope, digging pits to trip cavalry, driving sharpened stakes to impale charging horses. They transformed the hillside into a death trap, then waited. Across the valley, French chaos hid behind glittering splendor. Nobles paraded in polished armor, banners whipping in the wind, each determined to outshine the next. Dukes and counts bickered over who would lead the charge or seize Edward alive for ransom. Some boasted they'd drag the English king back in chains by nightfall. Philip VI's attempts at order were drowned in a storm of horns, drums, and vanity. The scene resembled a tournament more than a disciplined army. When dawn broke on August 26th, the French vanguard advanced through the smoldering ruins left by Edward's chevauchée. Villages still burned, crops lay in ash, livestock scattered, a grim prelude to the slaughter that was about to begin. Peasants muttered curses as they watched ranks of armored knights thunder past the wreckage of their homes. To the French nobility, this devastation was an insult, demanding instant vengeance. To the English, it proved their plan was working. They had turned France itself into a weapon. Philip VI's army reached Crécy around 4 p.m. On August 26th, utterly exhausted after a punishing march. The sensible decision would have been to rest and strike at dawn. Philip actually gave the order to halt, but patience was not a French noble's virtue. Strategy was for lesser men. They saw the English perched on that hill, outnumbered, filthy, far from home, and smelled glory. Each lord wanted to be the one to capture or kill Edward III. By late afternoon, thunderclouds gathered. A sudden downpour drenched the fields. The French laughed, trusting their plate armor to keep them safe. But the storm meant something entirely different for missile troops. The English quietly unstrung their bows, tucking the cords under helmets and cloaks to keep them dry. The Genoese crossbowmen, their hired allies, weren't so lucky. Their bowstrings slackened and stretched, useless compared to the taut yew of the English longbows. That small act of foresight, a few minutes of preparation, would decide the fate of thousands. When Philip VI finally arrived and saw the English calmly arrayed on the slope, banners rippling in the wind, he commanded his men to wait for morning. But knights do not wait. Behind him, counts and dukes surged forward, shouting that daylight was wasting and glory slipping away. Some had already lowered their lances. The king's command dissolved instantly. The grand French host ceased to be an army. It became a mob of impatient aristocrats, unwilling to let discipline stand between them and vanity. Thus the Battle of Crécy began, not with strategy, but with pride spiraling out of control. The vanguard ignored orders and advanced. Once a few nobles began to move, the rest followed, desperate not to be left behind in the chase for fame. Philip had lost control before the first blow was struck. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a noble mob galloping to its own destruction. First came the Genoese crossbowmen, 5,000 of the finest mercenary marksmen money could buy. But there was an issue. Their pavises, the large shields used for cover while reloading, were still with the baggage train. They had to advance without protection. The recent rain had also ruined them. While English archers had kept their bowstrings dry, the Genoese strings sagged and weakened, cutting their range nearly in half. They marched forward to about 150 yards and loosed their first volley. Most bolts fell short. Then came the English reply. 5,000 longbows sang together, a sound described by witnesses as thunder. The sky darkened beneath the storm of arrows. Each archer loosed 12 per minute, 60,000 shafts raining down every 60 seconds. The Genoese had no shields, no cover, and their crossbows took half a minute to reload against the longbows' 5 seconds. They were being erased from existence. Panic broke them, and they fled back toward their own lines. And then came madness. Count d'Alençon, seeing the retreat, bellowed, "Cut down this rabble blocking our way." French knights spurred forward, mowing down their own mercenaries. They literally slaughtered the Genoese for not dying fast enough. Caught between English arrows and French blades, the mercenaries were annihilated. Those few who escaped cursed their employers and abandoned the field. Now the main assault began. 12,000 mounted knights charging uphill through mud and over corpses into a rain of English arrows. This is where the longbow's real terror showed itself. At long range, arrows often failed to pierce the best plate, but they didn't need to. They found the horses, eyes, mouths, joints, legs, the soft places no armor covered. A horse weighing 1,500 pounds, hit by multiple arrows, didn't keep charging. It screamed, reared, and collapsed, becoming a wall of flesh that halted those behind. Knights crashed into the fallen, the charge lost all momentum. At closer distances, under 100 yards, the longbow's bodkin-tipped arrows could pierce mail and even plate at weak points, through visors into faces, through joints into armpits, through mail into thighs. Even when they didn't penetrate, the impact was brutal, like being struck with a hammer. Repeated hits rattled the men inside their armor, like dice inside a cup. The French charged again and again, waves upon waves, climbing over their own dead. The English archers had pre-planted arrows in the ground for easy access, keeping up a ceaseless storm of fire. Chroniclers said the arrows fell like snow, so dense that the knights could barely see through them. But it wasn't just the arrows doing the killing. The terrain itself, shaped by Edward's men, became the executioner. Horses broke legs in hidden pits. Riders crashed onto sharpened stakes. The soaked earth turned to sucking mud. Knights who fell couldn't rise under 60 pounds of steel. They became immobile targets. And here's the image that defines the horror. When the English archers ran out of arrows, they rushed into the field, pulled shafts from the corpses and wounded Frenchmen, and fired them back. The French were dying by their own recycled pain. Then entered the blind King John of Bohemia, a man determined to die with honor. Blind for nearly a decade, he refused to leave the field. When told the battle was lost, he reportedly said, "The King of Bohemia does not flee from battle." He ordered his knights to tie their horses' reins to his, so they could guide him forward. He wanted to strike at least one blow before death. The blind, 50-year-old king charged straight into the English lines, slashing at sound and shadow. He and all his bound knights were cut down instantly. When his body was found, he was still tied to his fallen companions, sword in hand, eyes open. He had fulfilled his wish. He had struck before dying. Edward III's son, the Black Prince, was so moved by his courage that he adopted John's personal emblem, 3 ostrich feathers and the motto, Ich dien, meaning I serve. It remains the symbol of the Prince of Wales to this day. By nightfall, the French had charged 16 separate times, 16 suicidal waves of noble blood thrown into the grinder. Each charge was less disciplined than the one before. Desperate nobles fought each other for the front, for one last chance at glory. only to sink and die in the same mud as all the others. Philip VI himself led the final desperate charge. His horse was struck down beneath him, and an arrow tore through his jaw. His guards had to drag him from the battlefield as he struggled to rejoin the fight. The sacred oriflamme, France's battle banner believed to promise victory, was left abandoned in the mud. As night fell, the English barely believed what had happened. They held their ground until morning, cutting down any wounded Frenchmen who tried to crawl away. Their arrow supply had long been exhausted, forcing them to finish the job with knives, mallets, and wooden stakes. English peasant archers were literally clubbing French nobles to death with sticks. When dawn broke on August 27th, the scale of the massacre became undeniable. The flower of French aristocracy lay lifeless in the mud. The Count of Flanders, the Count of Blois, the Duke of Lorraine, the Count of Alençon, the Count of Sancerre. The list seemed endless. Over 1,500 nobles were dead, 11 princes, thousands of lesser knights. The Genoese mercenaries who hadn't fled were also slaughtered, many by the very men who had hired them. English losses totaled around 40 dead, with only 2 knights among them. 1 English knight for every 750 French nobles. The imbalance was so absurd that chroniclers of the time refused to believe it, calling it an act of divine will. But the truth was far simpler. In one afternoon, the longbow had rendered heavy cavalry obsolete. Yet the true devastation wasn't in the numbers, but in who had died. Medieval warfare had always relied on capturing nobles for ransom, a kind of unspoken contract of chivalry. Killing the wealthy was bad business. But at Crécy, English archers, common men with no sense of knightly honor, simply killed everyone. They sent arrows through the faces of dukes and counts without caring who they were. The psychological shock to Europe's nobility was catastrophic. For centuries, being a knight meant superiority, a divine right to dominate the battlefield. Crécy shattered that illusion. It proved that a Welsh peasant with a bow could end the life of a lord as easily as another knight could. Military dominance no longer came from blood, but from discipline, innovation, and tactics. The aftermath was grotesque. So many nobles perished that there weren't enough peers left to bury them with honor. Bodies rotted for days in the heat. Crows and wolves feasted on princely flesh. Peasants scavenged the dead, stripping armor and jewelry that would make them rich overnight. Armor once meant to protect was melted down and sold for profit. The exhausted English army marched onward to Calais, leaving behind a field so littered with noble corpses that locals renamed it the Field of the Cloth of Gold, for the shimmering garments that covered the dead. For years afterward, farmers ploughing the soil unearthed bones and rusted armor. Grim relics of the day chivalry died. France was left in chaos. So many nobles gone in a single day created a leadership vacuum. Entire provinces lost their lords. Administration collapsed. The army had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Crossbowmen were recruited, native archer corps formed, and humiliatingly, English infantry tactics copied. Crécy also transformed the very nature of war. The dominance of archery meant combat now unfolded at range. The era of gallant cavalry charges was finished. Battles became contests of positioning, planning, and ranged firepower, not courage or swordsmanship. The romance of medieval combat drowned in the mud of Crécy. Yet France failed to learn quickly. A decade later, at Poitiers, they made the same mistake, charging uphill into English archers with identical results. Another king captured, thousands more nobles slain. It would take nearly a century for France to fully accept that common archers were more valuable than armored knights. The social consequences were even deeper. If peasants could destroy nobles, what did that say about divine right? If Welsh criminals could slay princes, what justified the feudal order? Crécy didn't just kill France's nobility. It murdered the idea that noble blood meant superiority. The English Longbowmen became Europe's most feared soldier. But irony soon followed. The longbow required years of training. You couldn't produce archers overnight. When gunpowder arrived, weapons that any peasant could master in a day, the longbow, too, became obsolete. The tool that killed chivalry was itself destroyed by progress. The blind king of Bohemia's final charge became legend, a symbol of doomed honor. His decision to die fighting rather than retreat embodied the last flicker of medieval chivalry. His death marked the end of an age when valor meant more than survival. Modern historians regard Crécy as a revolution in warfare. It proved that tactics and technology could crush numbers and courage, that well-prepared defenses could obliterate mounted charges, that coordinated firepower could dominate hand-to-hand combat. Every principle of modern warfare was born in that muddy French field in 1346. But perhaps the most haunting image remains this: French knights, the proud elite of Christendom, trampling their own men to reach the enemy faster, only to die beneath a storm of arrows. English peasants calmly firing into the chaos as nobles fell like wheat before the scythe. The Count d'Alençon, who had ordered the slaughter of his own Genoese, was himself struck through the face moments later. The French killed more of their own that day than the English lost in total. The crows grew so fat from noble flesh they could scarcely fly, waddling between corpses too heavy to take wing, a grotesque metaphor for the fall of an entire class. Today, a small monument marks the field at Crécy. Few visitors stop there. Yet on August 26, 1346, that muddy slope saw the medieval world end. 5 centuries of military tradition, the entire idea of warrior nobility, died in an afternoon, slain by peasants with bent wood and string. The English didn't just win a battle. They proved that courage could not defeat mathematics, that nobility could not stop arrows, and that the age of the knight was over. France lost more than men that day. They lost their belief in the natural order of the world. All it took was 5,000 peasants practicing archery every Sunday after church. If you're fascinated by history's bloodiest and most brutal clashes, like, subscribe, and comment below. Tell us where you're watching from.